I'm Stephen Foskett from Gestalt IT, and this is the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast. Today's premise is all about Kubernetes. We're wondering, is this just a flash in the pan? So to kick things off, I'm going to turn it over to James Green. And James, what do you think?
Well, so we were here, some of us anyway, earlier this week at OpenStack Summit, and now we're wrapping up the first day of this Tech Field Day, and I think almost everywhere we've been this week, we've been hearing about Kubernetes. And so my first question to you guys is just, with as exciting as it seems to be right now, is that going to continue to be the trend, or is it a flash in the pan, Kubernetes?
So I'll start off by saying Kubernetes certainly has the lead at the moment. As has been proven many times over, is the first one to market, is the most mature at the moment. Remain that way forever? Not necessarily, right? How many times have we seen the number 2 or number 3 come along and perfect things, so to speak? Apple famously did this with things like the iPod, the iPhone, etc. So, while yes, Kubernetes has the most functionality, it certainly has the most deployments today. Does that mean that it will continue to lead forever? Not necessarily.
Yeah, and it's got the, I mean, that's the thing, it's got the mind share. It's been pretty hilarious going to conferences in 2017 and seeing everyone talking Kubernetes, no matter what the topic of the conference is. I mean, heck, I think that you could probably go to the, I don't know, mainframe COBOL conference, and they would be saying, and by the way, we've got a Kubernetes session coming up, Well,
I mean, the big problem with Kubernetes still, I think, and you probably know as well, is it's the installation. I mean, being able to get this up and running and functional in a state that's stable and easily to maintain.
Yeah.
And it's funny you say that, right? Because this week was OpenStack Summit.
Yeah.
What's been OpenStack's #1 detractor over the years, right?
Thing.
Install and upgrade.
Exactly.
So will they learn lessons from their predecessors, right? Which there's a lot of similar functionality that exists inside of there, right? There's an argument to be made that, okay, I work for a storage company, right? The persistence paradigms, right, that exist inside of Kubernetes mimic a lot of what's happening inside of the OpenStack ecosystem.
So you hear about those two technologies in tandem quite a bit. Is the success of one or the other in the market dependent on the other, or if OpenStack ceases to be as important as it has been the last couple of years, does Kubernetes go with it, or just by nature of the number of other things that Kubernetes does, is it okay?
I think Kubernetes could help OpenStack, but I don't know that Kubernetes will depend on OpenStack to survive, I think is the way that I would sum that up. I think OpenStack stands to gain a lot of ground, and I think Kubernetes could help orchestrate, help getting, stabilizing that deployment, what we were talking about a minute ago. But I don't know that Kubernetes itself is going to live and die by OpenStack. I think it's got support for so many other different things at this point.
Yeah, I think short term, right, they're both sort of poaching from the same application pool, right? Yeah. They both target cloud native applications. So long term, are cloud native applications successful, I think is going to ultimately be the question. And then the secondary one is, okay, does OpenStack remain successful? Is Kubernetes independently successful or dependent on that? I think ultimately that's going to be dependent on whether or not a development team, an applications team adopts containers as their deployment paradigm. And second to that, do the operators, the infrastructure teams that are supporting these things, trust something like a Kubernetes versus an OpenStack, right, in order to provide that infrastructure, support that infrastructure, manage that infrastructure, right, all of those types of things.
What do you think drove the fad with Kubernetes so much over the others?
That's a good question.
I mean, what
yeah, because there are others.
There's plenty of others.
Why don't somebody, it doesn't have to be you, somebody hit that before you answer that question. If it's not going to be Kubernetes, what are other options for people?
Well, you got Mesos, I guess.
You got Mesos, you got Docker Swarm.
I was very surprised, Sully, at your chart earlier that you showed to see Swarm and Mesos so far down the list, especially with Build Your Own being #2. So what are some of the things you see facilitating, especially the Build Your Own movement, as opposed to something like a Swarm or a Mesos that I figured would have, good market share at this point with the Docker backing?
Yeah, so Build Your Own is really vague, right? And I think what, at least the OpenStack user survey, when it lumps Build Your Own together, we're really talking about things like bash scripts, or arguably even Puppet and Chef and the other desired state configuration tools that are just scheduling containers out against a virtual machine. So you're replacing a Puppet manifest that is saying install these RPMs and configure these things with just deploy this container.
Would you throw PowerShell DSC in there as well?
So remember, desired state versus container scheduling versus application deployment.
Okay, sure.
Yes, right, potentially, but you got to squint a little bit.
Yeah.
So what's driven Kubernetes success thus far? Honestly, I think it's Google's charisma, right?
That's
Yeah, there's the cool Google factor.
Yeah,
Google
but
effect,
people like Kelsey Hightower out there, right, beating the streets, right, knocking on doors, right, keeping everybody's interest up there, right. Google being a fantastic community member, right. They donated Kubernetes to the CNCF, right. They are accepting submissions, right, PRs from people all across the community. They're responding to the needs. I think that speaks volumes when we start to take a look at what application, especially cloud native guys, are looking at. They're used to AWS. They're used to Azure. Where it's really going to start to get interesting is transitioning from a pre-production environment, right, or an application team supporting a production environment, right. I've asked a lot of virtualization admins, hey, how many virtual machines are your apps guys requesting, right? Are they still requesting the 10, 20, 30 VMs a week that they used to? Or has it settled down a little bit? And suddenly they've got a Kubernetes cluster running on top of those, and they're deploying it all themselves. So I think as that pushes down the stack, down into the operations guys, and they have their requirements, right? Apps guys look at, how do I deploy a new feature? How do I fix this bug? Operations guys look at, how do I keep it running? How do I figure out what went wrong when it inevitably does, right? How do I recover from that going wrong? So what are the tools that support those things? VMware famously made it really easy to figure that out.
For the people that don't know, where does the line between Kubernetes and infrastructure start and stop? Where do you need an infrastructure management team versus application deployment or container management, things of that nature that kind of Kubernetes is known for? Where does that line?
So the fuzzy line is the operating system, right?
Okay.
I mean, it's Linux. So are you responsible for the operating system and up or the operating system and down? Okay. That's kind of the way it looks now. So we've seen
is that dependent on like whether or not your app needs kernel access, kind of?
So kernel modification automatically makes it a suspicious target for containerization at this time.
True. Yeah,
right?
that's fair.
Because remember, containers are a shared kernel model. So if I got to load a module, it's going to get hard real quick.
Yeah.
But maybe he means like libraries and tools and so on.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is you need a DevOps team, right?
Yeah, or, you know, the more DevOps in the title, the better, right? I get paid by the buzzword. I don't know about you guys.
Exactly.
So you said VMware famously made it easy to deploy and manage virtual machines. Is there room for a company to make the same thing happen with Kubernetes where, say, like Platform 9, who's helping people who don't have the skill set or desire to deploy and manage this stuff, they're making it easier to do. Is there room for a company like that to exist for the long term and make it feasible for people who it otherwise wouldn't be? Because I think, and let me kind of tag a question on there, is part of the reason why build your own is so high up on the list that the people who have the capability to actually make something like Kubernetes work figure we can just do it ourselves and it'll already be exactly what we need instead of trying to make Kubernetes work the way we need it.
Yeah.
You know.
So the first one, right? I think that's already happening, right? We see Tectonic. Tectonic is CoreOS plus Kubernetes with support, right? We see Platform 9. We see now OpenShift, right? Which is Red Hat's Kubernetes plus.
Yep.
So we're already starting to see those supported Kubernetes, right? Those managed Kubernetes services, if you will, and making it easier to deploy those things. You know, OpenStack was kind of early to that game. Things like Project Magnum, right? Where I can go in and using heat orchestration, deploy a bunch of Nova instances and layer Kubernetes on top of it. Yep. We've started to see heat peter out. It never really took off in any substantial way, but it's started to peter out from where it was even. So is that going to go anywhere? It's hard to tell. But I think that much like we are seeing more and more managed OpenStack services now, I wouldn't be surprised if we see that happening. Now, the managed, or the roll your own type of deployment paradigms, I'm starting to wonder if this isn't, it's not a lift and shift type application, right? In other words, so if I am a software company, right, and I am creating a Linux-based software package, previously, I write all my code, and then I put it into a .deb, I put it into an RPM, I put it into all these different packagers. And then I say, okay, I need to test against CentOS 6.1234567 8 9. How many CentOSs are we up to, right? All the RHELs, all the SUSEs, all the Ubuntus, all the Debians, right? Or I put it into a Docker container. And I say, hey, so long as your host is running Docker, we're good to go. Right, so is this simply software vendors repackaging their applications, right, or even custom in-house developed applications being repackaged to ultimately not be any different except abstracting the deployment.
Yeah, I think that to your point, there's a point where maybe the maturation of the industry and the adoption of things like containers and orchestration engines, you'll start to see some of those move up as more non-savvy, I don't want to call them super geeks, but I'm a geek myself, so I'll throw that in there, that can sit there and write their own code and their own scripts and everything. That might be why the prevalence is so high. But as the industry shifts as a whole more towards this direction, I think we'll see some of the more pre-installed, next finish kind of installations start to come in, and I think that's what will really move it forward. Right now, you really still have to live at a command line and be able to write your own kind of YAML files and parameters and whatnot.
Yeah, right. I'm really wondering what the impact Microsoft is going to have here.
I think Nano in Azure could have a huge impact.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if they're going to roll their own sort of orchestration engine rather than leveraging.
And I think Kubernetes. They will, but I think the reason is because, like OpenStack, I think Kubernetes is just too big. I'm wondering if it's really possible to make it a small to big solution, because it was designed for mega, and it's been certainly pulled down to merely large. But I'm wondering if you're talking about using like Kubernetes in like an application install from a vendor. Is that really practical to have it be? Think about the size, the real size of most even mid-sized business applications. Is it really practical to have all that?
You're talking about deploying a full Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I was more referring to just containerization, not necessarily orchestration being that deployment mechanism. But
yeah, because I'm with you on containerization, because I think that's one of the things people overlook with Docker. The reason I love Docker is because I can keep all the libraries and supporting, revisions of everything contained, literally, and I can run like the right version of Python or the right version of Ruby or the right version of even like Java or whatever, and not have it, screw up the rest of the system by having to install some back-revved version. And that is fantastic. I am right there with you on that, and I think containers are going to totally rule the world because of that. But what about Kubernetes? Does Kubernetes rule the world?
So, I mean, one of the big challenges that I think OpenStack has had as a project is
OpenStack's too big.
Decision by committee. And thus far, Google still holds, one, they're holding up to their mantra of don't be evil, right? They're acting in the community's interest, but they are actually making the decisions, right? They are driving things forward, as opposed to a lot of OpenStack projects where it's a group of 5, 10, 20 people who have to, nobody has to disagree before a decision is made, and sometimes that's pretty hard.
Larry, I know that you've been doing some pretty big work in this space recently, but all of you guys have more of an infrastructure-focused background, at least recently. I want to ask you, how do people who are infrastructure-focused now or have been need to be thinking about this stuff?
I mean, I've spent a lot. I mean, I do come from a developer's background, but I've spent the last 15 years probably in infrastructure, and probably the last 3 coming back to development and infrastructure as code and CI pipelines and just the whole, you name it, automation. I try to spend as much time with people that are especially traditional core infrastructure guys, because they're very, very hard to break, to get them into methodologies of going down this route, being able to use Vagrant and things. I share this stuff. Try to get them to think in a different mode of how they do things, right? It's, I use the example of, instead of hacking your way through things, put it in code. Being able to use Docker and containers and things like that to test methods, things like that.
Well, so we had a little conversation off to the side right before the podcast started recording about automation and why there's some resistance to automation, particularly among operations guys, right? I've worked with customers who say, we refuse to automate because Andrew can go and break one server at a time. Automation breaks hundreds of servers at a time.
Break all the servers.
So sometimes it's, operations guys who have been burnt, who have been hurt before and had those late night calls or long weekends because of a typo. They learn that lesson the hard way, and then suddenly they're skittish.
Yeah, and that was the core to the podcast we did, is DevOps a disaster. The core of that was, it's not inherently a disaster, but it's a disaster if there's really no infrastructure operations knowledge and wisdom passed into it.
And
You know what I mean?
And that's the problem, and that's what I see day in and day out is you have, I'm trying to think the best way to say it, you have those that are new school, right? They don't have the same background and infrastructure that most of us have, right? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Which is very different.
Yeah.
It's not a bad thing, but being able to get the two to play together, you know, the old schoolers and the new schoolers, and kind of work through and get those methodologies together that work.
So,
for example,
is that the role of a DevOps team, if such a thing exists? Is that the role of an SRE, right? Is to bridge that gap?
It's funny because I've heard the same things, the
I've kinda
same
got
questions in the last couple weeks, actually,
Yeah.
months.
I've kind of got a leg
Yeah.
on each fence. I am an older infrastructure guy, sure. I embrace virtualization, but at the same time, I can see, I think, Sully, you brought it up in your presentation earlier about people got tired of being told no. And I think that's a real thing. And I personally will, you know, in a way, it's a defiant sort of, well, I know how to do this stuff anyway, so I'm going to go write a few lines of code and do it without Mr. Storage Administrator because he's just, you know, doing that. But I have written some really buggy VB scripts that has brought down, you know, big servers and stuff like that. So at the same time, I kind of understand. I kind of respect and appreciate how it's going to move the industry forward. But yeah, at the same time, I'm a little hesitant because I know how fragile infrastructure can be, and you know, you have to be careful. You can't just let a developer just push it straight to production, right?
Yeah, and
That's the
developers, if they're responsible for production, developers like to solve things at the application layer because that's where they have control.
Yeah.
So if they can solve an infrastructure problem at the application layer, even if it gets really messy and really just uncomfortably inefficient, right? That's what they're going to do.
Yep.
But then you run into buffer overruns, memory leaks, all kinds of ugly shit that brings infrastructure down.
But from their perspective, they stay in control, right?
Exactly.
Well, that's about all we've got time for, unfortunately. So I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen to close us out, and we'll be done.
Well, thank you, James. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And again, this did kind of turn into a sequel of the DevOps disaster fiasco. So if you're interested in listening to that one, it has. It's in. Go into the archives, gestaltit.com/podcast. There's the archives, and you'll find that one in there. We're publishing a new episode every second Tuesday, so I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll subscribe and listen in next time.
The On-Premise IT Roundtable is once again brought to you by Gestalt IT, home to IT coverage from across the enterprise. Make sure to follow us on Twitter @GestaltIT and at facebook.com/GestaltIT. Very original. The On-Premise IT Roundtable is produced by Rich Straffolino. That's me! Until next time, from all of us here at Gestalt IT, have a super sparkly day.